Hello everyone, I'm Anubhav and welcome to the part 8 of the blog series on OData. In the previous blog, we had seen the OData service structure, which included the OData service document and OData service metadata. We looked at an existing OData service and the data model in the system, and then we looked at the URI conventions for OData to send different requests by the consumer on the OData service. In this video, I will create an OData service for the flight data model that we had discussed earlier. So let's get into the system. Before going to the SEGW, which is the SAP NetWeaver Gateway Service Builder, we should go to the configurations via SPRO to activate the gateway services. So you can follow the path and then click on this icon to activate or deactivate the SAP NetWeaver gateway services. In this case, it is already active, and that is why it is asking whether we want to deactivate it or not. So I'm just going to cancel it. It gives me a message saying that SAP NetWeaver gateway is active, which is fine. The next thing I am going to do is going to the NetWeaver gateway services. This is the service that we saw the last time, and we will create a service which is similar to the flight demo that we had created earlier, but we'll create it from scratch this time. So we start with by creating a project. So I give the project name and the description, and I create it as a local object. So you can see that my service structure has been created. It has nothing much yet. It has an empty data model with entity types and entity sets and associations. Everything else is empty. So let's start by importing, creating the data model. So there are multiple ways to create a data model. I can also start by creating the entity type um, manually, in which case I would enter everything on my own. The other intuitive way to do it is by importing the model from either a file or a DDIC structure or an RFC or a BOR interface. So let me start. Even before that, let me just open another window for the backend APIs that are available, based on which we will create our service data model. So this is the set of function modules that I had created to support my OData service. Um Let me just start by creating uh, the first entity set. Um, Let me give. Let's start by creating the first entity type, which is flight carrier via the DDIC structure. Let me give it a name, flight carrier, and it's an entity type. The structure that I'm going to give here is scar. Uh, Go ahead. So this is the scar table. I can select multiple fields or properties that I would want in my OData service. Click on next, and then define what will be the key of the key property of the entity type, which will uniquely identify the entity. Let me also go to the scar table just to give you the uh, idea of how the table is structured. So we have a key char id. Similarly, I have created a key here. Say finish. My first entity set has been created, which is flight carrier. It has these following properties. It takes the core type, EDM core type, based on what is the field structure on the app. So since it was a uh, char 3 field on the ABAP side, it automatically converted into the EDM string data type. Similarly, I can create another entity type using the RFC interface. In this time, I will create flight schedule, and I will create it via the RFC, and this is the function module wherein the flight connections are returned based on the flight carrier. So I'll give this name here. So what it does is it gives me the importing and exporting parameters for the function module, and I will select from the structure itself what should be the structure of my entity type. So I selected car ID, con ID, which is the airline ID, and the flight number, country from, country to, um, city from, city to, uh, flight time, departure and arrival time, distance. That's it. Then the next thing I do is define what is the key, and then that is it. My entity type is created, and on the entity sets you can see another node coming for the flight schedule. And finally, I create another, or rather import another entity type, which is flight. Okay, I think let me start by creating a project. So I give name to the project and the description, and create a local object. So you can see the basic structure of the OData service has already been created, but there's nothing much into it. So let's start by creating the data model. There are multiple ways to create the data model. The first thing that you would want to do is to create the entity types, which is the basic building block for the data model, as we saw in the last video. I can manually create the entity types from here, but the better option would be to create it from the ABAP DDIC structures, or the RFC interface itself. So let's start by creating the first entity type, which is the flight carrier, and I'll do it by creating it via the tick structure. So let me just mention the name of the entity type and then the structure as schar. You can see the schar data structure on the ABAP side was pulled up, and all the on the back end has been pulled up, and you can see all the properties here. You can deselect and select anything that you would want in your service, and then move on to the next step where you define the key of your entity type, which uniquely identifies the entity, and then finish it. And in the process, we also created the entity set by default. Uh, Similarly, I'll create another or import another entity type, which is the flight connections, and this time we take the SPFLI map structure. We look at all these fields. The fields are coming from the backend structure of SPFLI. We select the fields which we are interested in, the carrier ID, the connection ID, um, maybe the country from, city from, country to, city to, flight time, departure times, arrival times, distance, measure of unit. That's it, and then move on next to the next, and again define the key as carrier ID and con ID, um, based on which the flight connection can be uniquely identified. Here is the checkbox for creating the entity set by default, otherwise you have to create it on your own. Uh, the entity set represents the collection of the entity. So now you see that there are two entities which are created, and then the two entity sets as well. Let's quickly create the third entity, and this time let's do it from the RFC interface. We do it for flight schedule. Um, you could mention a remote target system in case if your gateway um, is a separate system than the backend, which means it's not an embedded setup, but it's deployed as a hub. Anyways, in this case, it's locally deployed. I'll just provide the RFC, and in the in the object navigator, you can see this is the function module that I have created for the backend support to get the flight schedule given the car ID and con ID. So what I'll do is copy this function module name and provide it here. Go on next. What it does is it's give me the import and export structures from which I can select and create my entity type. So in this case, I want my car ID and con ID, flight date maybe, and maximum seats, the seats occupied, in the various classes, economy, business, and first class. Maybe that's it. And then, as before, specify what should be my key of the flight schedule.